Hello, this is Brett Mortis, and we are doing our presentation on carbon nanotubes. We are Brett Mortis, undergraduate student at the University of Connecticut, and Cody Unger, also undergraduate student at the University of Connecticut. The abstract our project is on was pulled from the AICHE website, and it will be on carbon nanotubes, characterization, functionalization, and application. Basically, we're going to talk about their general properties, the structure, and how these carbon nanotubes are used in some specific examples. Some may be asking, what are carbon nanotubes? Well, carbon nanotubes are one of 8 allotropes of carbon. They were first discovered in 1952 by some Soviet scientists. Their shape resembles a hollow tube with a wall thickness of exactly 1 atom. These walls are constructed of carbon atoms linked together by sp2 bonds. Basically, they're a arrangement of hexagonal shape connected to one another. Carbon nanotubes are also very lightweight. They are also extremely strong, about 6 times stronger than steel. They possess an extremely strong tensile strength, which can be thought of as the strength of a rope being pulled in either direction. They are also extremely stiff. There is a multitude of variety of nanotubes. There are single-walled nanotubes, the zigzag, the armchair, and the chiral, and there are the multi-walled nanotubes, the scroll and the Russian doll. In this slide, we can see the different types of single-walled nanotubes. We have zigzag, armchair, and chiral. These, in the top left-hand picture, we can see from the network of covalently bonded carbon atoms the different angles at which each of these types of nanotubes is wrapped. Single-walled carbon nanotubes consist of a single layer of carbon atoms, all sharing sp2 bonds, wrapped in a cylinder. These sp2 bonds that the carbon atoms share are even stronger than those that are found in diamond. The single-walled nanotubes serve extremely well as conductors, even better than the conventional copper wire. This makes them a very likely candidate for future miniaturizing of electrical components, like, let's say, laptops or iPods even. One of the types of single-walled nanotubes is the armchair nanotube. They consist of hexagonal rings aligned down the length of the tube. These types of nanotubes have the strongest tensile strength of the 3 types of single-walled nanotubes. Another type of carbon nanotube is a zigzag nanotube. This type has hexagonal rings running around the circumference of the tube, as opposed to the armchair nanotube, which has hexagonal rings running along the length of instead. This type of nanotube has the same stiffness as that as an armchair single-walled nanotube. The last type of single-walled nanotube is the chiral nanotube. This type has hexagonal rings spiraling around the circumference of the tube. Obviously a different shape, yet very hard to determine just by a first glance. This type has the lowest tensile strength as well as the lowest Young's modulus, or the stiffness, out of the 3 varieties of the single-walled nanotubes. Here we have 2 different types of multi-walled carbon nanotubes. First off, the Russian doll variety, which consists of many nanotubes sitting inside one another, and the parchment or scroll nanotube, which consists of a single sheet of carbon nanotube wrapped around itself. These multi-walled carbon nanotubes show many different characteristics than those of the single-walled nanotubes. They're stronger, they're stiffer, and they have a much greater resistance to chemicals. This said, the multi-walled carbon nanotubes lack the electrical properties which the single-walled nanotubes display. Some of the possible applications for these nanotubes are solar cells, wires in space elevators, microwave generators, surge protectors, high-intensity lamps, and finally ultracapacitors. We will only be going over a few of these different types of possible applications. Here we see carbon nanotubes in solar cells. These solar cells consist of many carbon nanotubes resting on a silicon wafer which is coated in a photovoltaic material. These nanotubes are sticking up and capture the light energy from the sun. Going more in depth into these solar cells, the photons that become trapped within the carbon nanotubes are converted to electrons by the photovoltaic material. Conventional solar cells reflect a lot of the potential light that the sun emits onto them. This is because they rarely capture from different angles the sun's rays. Carbon nanotubes, on the other hand, capture light from many different angles, thus reducing the amount of photons reflected back. Since more photons are being captured in these type of solar cell, a thinner layer of photovoltaic material can be used. Since the carbon nanotube cells use less photovoltaic material, this increases the flow rate of electrons coming from the cell. They can also produce about twice the energy as a conventional cell. However, these cells have only been produced on a small scale. The next slide, we will be talking about ultracapacitors. In order to understand ultracapacitors, we'll first need to understand how regular capacitors work. Capacitors are electronic devices which are used to store energy. In capacitor, you have two electrodes, one positively charged, one negatively charged, in which the electric current is not running, therefore building up a potential difference between the two electrodes. An ultracapacitor is a capacitor with an extremely high energy density, implying that more energy can be used per volume in the capacitor. In an ordinary capacitor, the energy is stored by the potential difference, which I just explained. When the energy is needed, the electrons flow across the capacitor and provide a burst of energy. An ultracapacitor is different from a regular capacitor because of the double layer that it provides. The double layer principle is where electrodes immersed in an ionic solution move toward oppositely charged electrodes to create another potential difference between the different sides of the solution. Now, why would we put carbon nanotubes in these ultracapacitors when they already work? Well, the introduction of vertically aligned carbon nanotubes in these ultracapacitors as electrodes greatly enhances the energy and power densities. Basically, this is because the nanotubes have a very high conductivity, they have a higher effective surface area on which the electrons can travel from, they have thinner electrode size, and they have vertically aligned nanotubes. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you liked our show, then go check out our links.